Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're ready to start the session, which is about resilience and economic planning. What we want to examine today with a fairly provocative title is whether water can be made as a currency to evaluate resilience, can be made center stage in economic forecasting, economic planning, in order to tackle resilience. And my name is Sophie Trémollet. I'm the water team lead at the OECD. I'm working mostly on economics and financing of water, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session with a very distinguished set of speakers who are effectively behind what is called the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience initiative, which has been going for a number of years and is looking at carrying out this analysis in certain countries, but also has been engaging with multiple actors that can affect that transformation in terms of economic planning and reflection in investment decisions. So without further ado, I'll invite Niels Vlaanderen to come and give us an introduction about what this initiative is, what it's about, what the Dutch government is looking to do with this initiative, and then we will introduce the other speakers later. Dutch.
Thank you, Sophie. So I was asked to give some introductory remarks. So let me start where this initiative is coming from, and also the initiative Water Resilience for Economic Resilience, but also its report, Managing Water for Economic Resilience, because they both lay the foundation for this session. Some years ago, it was just before the COVID crisis struck us that we set out together. I think it was John and a dear colleague from Deltares, Kees van der Guchten, and myself. And there we said, well, we realized also with us, the awareness is slowly increasing on the role of water, on the pivotal role of water in the risks the world faces today and for the years to come. And this is especially true for the effects climate change has on the water cycle and the resulting impacts on our economies. And later when we developed this initiative, the recognition that this is an important role of water, the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience initiative, we realized there is a need to increase awareness among the financial and economic institutions regarding the importance of water resilience. For it has also become increasingly clear that proactive thinking and implement measures are needed to address these issues. Our initiative sheds light on the importance of integrating water resilience into economic planning, offering guidance and practical examples to policymakers, financial institutions, and other stakeholders. And let me explain a bit more why water is at the center of economic resilience. Economic resilience ensures that we have the capacity to adapt the economy, and most macroeconomic models assume a steady state, water as an unlimited, predictable input. In reality, as we know coming from the water sector, water is a flow that has limits and that can evolve over time and can be modified. Water crosses also administrative boundaries and sectoral boundaries and is often hidden in other entities, other sectors such as energy, cities, agriculture. So, for instance, in the soil, in the forest, and so on. And water can be mobilized as a medium for climate resilience with and between sectors. The work within the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience initiative is the result of a collaborative effort of a team both of economists and climate specialists. Let me give you a brief overview of today's session. We will start with the presentation of 3 case studies highlighting the issues of the water's role in economic development. Then there is one framing presentation on financial risk and resilience. As a third part, we have an open-ended discussion with you. And then there will be some additional remarks from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water and an update how you can be involved. All the sessions and the discussion, we defined some key themes. First, what does water resilience or the lack of thereof look like in the examples presented? How do water risk and opportunities ripple across the economy? What are the main economic impacts? And thirdly, what policy solutions are needed or are already being developed? And then I'd like to hand over again to Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you, Niels. Maybe just go back and... Great. So to exemplify this kind of thinking, what change of thinking is needed and what pressures are at play, we're going to hear from 3 case studies, place-based case studies, and we'll start with Felicia Marcus, who's going to tell us more about how California, which has been building its way out of drought, needs now to invest in a more sustainable manner and to invest now in a different manner, I presume, to forestall climate change's worst impacts. So over to you, Felicia. You are the Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Water Department, a lawyer by training, so with a lot of experience in water rights and in handling water issues in California and particularly in Los Angeles. So very, very grateful to have you on board. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take you on a very quick romp through some of the thinking in California and some of the very large-scale changes that we initiated around 10 years ago. It's going to take a long time to get there, but with an eye towards forestalling an enormous crisis that our then governor saw facing California if we didn't start acting now to do the things that it was going to take 30, 40 years to do. So it's less of a case study. Let me see if it'll show up. No? There we go. There we go. Less of a case study and more of a case story, so to speak. So less of a study and more of a story, and a story from a policy actor's point of view. Even though I'm at Stanford now, I'm not an academic. Part of my role is to translate between academia and policy for a variety of reasons I don't have time to explain. And of course, we know that water tends to be underappreciated and in some cases just assumed, which to those of us in the water world seems kind of nutty, but I'm sure we all have experienced that. In some places it's sold and seen as a commodity, and underpriced one at that, so actions are taken in the short term rather than the long term in many places. And the California story is seeing a crash coming ahead for the economy and for people in their daily lives, but for the economy of the state as a whole, if we don't act. You know, I don't have specific numbers. There are people working on this in many ways, but we know that we needed to move. And we're going to need better tools. My bottom line, we're going to need better tools and a better mindset to get to where we need to go. So with California, to answer the questions, what does it look like, California water resilience look like or lack thereof? Well, you got to understand quickly, and you won't pass a quiz on this, but quickly, what are some of the big elements in California water you need to know? Number one, that the water, most of the water for most Californians is imported from hundreds of miles away from other watersheds. So it is a very much artificial constructed, some of the greatest public works projects in the world for 3 huge watersheds, the Eastern Sierras, the Western Sierras, and the Colorado River. This extensive system of public works and conveyance that we're invested in the middle of the last century, that makes modern California possible, its economy, its social development, et cetera, particularly agriculture in the Central Valley, and the economic and social miracle of Southern California, which comprises well over half the population of the state. The way it works very simply is that you need storage and conveyance because the water doesn't fall in the time of year it's used, where it's used, or consistently. We have the most varied hydrology in the country, and so that requires this massive system of storage and conveyance to get any kind of consistency over time or to get the water where it needs to. With storage, people talk about dams and argue about dams, but our single largest storage Space is our snowpack, 30% on average, a lot more a lot of the time, is it then refills those reservoirs, replenishes the streams, and refills our groundwater basins at a pace they can't absorb. Reservoirs are not one and done. They are refilled during the course of the area, so that timing thing that you get from snowpack is critical, and that's what we lose under climate change. So there's a lot more happening in climate change. The main thing, few degrees temperature rise Fahrenheit, and we start losing it, which means more drought, more conflict, less storage to get you through those times. So losing that is huge. Just a picture, like where it is and where it's not. Sorry, I like cartoons. There are amazing system I could tell you, but again, this is responsible for the economy of California in large part. The major parts of the economy of California are the Central Valley on down. You know, one of only 5 Mediterranean climates that can grow the level of healthy fruits and vegetables, 90% of certain things for the country and export to the world. If you like almonds, this is kind of important to you. If you like salad in the winter, this is kind of important to you, that sort of thing. Okay, lack thereof. Impacts of the drought become cataclysmic rather than uncomfortable. For rural and agricultural communities, particularly, urban communities can kill their lawns. That's a lot of the water urban communities use. They can take shorter showers. You can't fallow a city, so they also will get more help. Radical conservation will impact and disrupt economies in a way, and we're trying to figure out how to quantify that a little bit. Ecosystems will face collapse. What's the value of that? Priceless, if you think about it. And not very much if you don't, and that's a whole nother topic to talk about. Groundwater won't be sufficient to buffer those droughts if we don't put enough water in those groundwater basins, and our Central Valley groundwater basins are the only thing in size that's comparable to the snowpack we're gonna lose. So to make that timing work, we had to go pedal to the metal on groundwater management, which took 100 years to do after surface water, so politically huge. And huge psychological and other impacts. This is the picture we all had on our bathroom mirror. This is what was like during the drought in the teens I was a part of. This is what we see more of under climate change. What does resilience look like? I'm not going to go through all of these. It's a whole list of things we need to make it. It's not one thing. It's a list of things: resilient groundwater basins, more efficient use of water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Taking care of ecosystems ahead of the curve, including upper watersheds. There's a whole lot of things, and a lot of personal things about having a healthier relationship with water and understanding the importance of ecosystems, agricultural areas, and urban areas across all of those areas. So a lot of literacy. This is a plan, if you're interested, that we came up. It's not a beautiful academic treatise. It's 18 pages that a regular person can read that gives an idea of the nightmare, the freight train of pain coming at us down the track in the decades to come if we don't act, and a manifesto to say we're going to stop arguing about which one of your projects is most important. We got to do all of them if we want to survive. And it was a very powerful political document to get people off their butts and off the arguments about who's more important, to say we're going to do all of these. It also yielded political support for $12 billion worth of bonds in our administration alone, and there's another one on the ballot in the next administration. So I commend it to you as not a beautiful academic treatise, but a document that was really helpful that we carried around, that was our strategic plan, and that the subsequent administration has built on, agreeing we have to go here. May disagree on priorities, but that groundwater management was historic because the governor put his stamp on it and got support for it, but conservation first and foremost. There's a lot more to say. The droughts, you can understand it. Droughts bring pain. Floods kill. There's a lot of pain that will happen in California. We've already had hundreds of thousands of acres fallowed, tens of thousands of people out of work. Does it hurt the overall economy of California? Actually didn't, because commodity prices went up and some areas did well, but certain communities were devastated, and that pain for one is actually pain for all if you think of your community as a community writ large. The uncertainty in the water is already hurting land values and the like, and in Southern California, because of the recognition of this problem, we have the 2 largest potable water recycling programs in the world in planning, not in operation, but you have the biggest one in the world now in Orange County in operation, where they're already recycling 100% of their wastewater. What are the opportunities? Well, it's obvious as you think about it. You can do more cost-effective multi-benefit work if you figure out how to articulate it. It's what we should have been articulated. Yeah, that's the right word. We should have been doing it all along, whether it's local stormwater or upper watershed work, the nature-based solutions work that so many people have talked about in this conference, which we also need to keep working on quantifying to justify and make it easy for policymakers to make these very expensive decisions. And then we're going to need to make structural changes. I don't have that much time, sorry, I'm talking so fast. So what do we need? This is what I wanted to make sure I got to. We need more accessible, and by accessible I mean understandable to regular people and policymakers rather than economists or people who are just selling water. We've got to create greater economic literacy about the fact that the costs of economic disruption are real, as opposed to thinking about water as a commodity and comparing per acre foot, which people still do. But what's the cost of recycling or even desal, which has more problems, so we've sort of put it into a little side bucket, but eventually it'll become cheaper, less environmentally degrading. We need to buy that time, but it's smarter, faster, and cheaper to recycle our water. But that's going to be a lot of money, a lot more money than the ratepayers can afford right now. And if you compare the cost of that to buying the imported water that we buy from the Metropolitan Water District, it seems crazy. But how do you measure the cost of it not being there? The cost, and we were on the verge, after just 2 years of a terrible drought a few years ago, of not being able to get water because of the piping and other things, to a big chunk of Los Angeles in just 2 years. Unprecedented. The driest year we had seen, coming on faster than we had seen before, and hotter. And so all of a sudden we're scrambling and trying to figure out how to articulate why we need to do this work. That's one. And we need better communication of all of the above, figuring out how to get those who are wonky and understand it to be able to articulate it in ways that the public, the media, and policymakers can understand. And of course, we need new and innovative financial tools that help us figure out how to pull more money into this effort if we have a hope of doing what we know we can do, which is to become resilient in the face of that nightmare, that freight train of pain. If we do all of the above over the next 2 or 3 decades, we'll buy ourselves the time for further technological breakthroughs and the like. But we really need to have a very different conversation about the economics of this and the impact of not having water, which again, it is assumed and taken for granted, and we definitely have to change that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Felicia, for this very clear and impactful presentation. I think this was excellent, and for pointing out the value of an 18-page plan. I love that. 18-page giving you 12 billion of leverage. That's a very good return on number of pages written. And so pointing out the importance of communication and bearing in mind the distributional impact. So who are we talking to? We're talking to different communities who are impacted in a different manner. Moving on, I'm pleased to welcome Diego Rodriguez, who's the lead water economist for Eastern and Southern Africa at the World Bank, based in Pretoria, who's been focusing for a long time now on climate change, resilience, and urban water security, previously working in Mexico, where he did similar work. And he's one of the key sort of developer of a decision tree framework to water resource planning and investment projects that you are now applying in multiple geographies. So over to you to talk to us about South Africa.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks, colleagues, for the opportunity. I'll be presenting a bit the work that we've been doing now for several years in South Africa. I'm based there, but I work also in many other countries in the region, and you see the dependency and how important it is, for example, transboundary aspects as well, when we look at building economic resilience on a particular country, in this case, in South Africa. And I wanted to emphasize one important aspect that I think I learned throughout the years working in this topic, is the fact that in this particular case, what we are doing here is helping the government in increasing its economic resilience through a water lens, but our main counterpart is not the water sector. Our main counterpart in this case is Treasury, National Treasury, sort of the Ministry of Finance, and it's also the Presidential Committee on Climate Change. And I want to stress this because we have the tendency of saying we need to work with the Ministry of Water to influence some of these agendas. And here of course, you work with the sectoral ministries and energy and others, but I think it's critical that we elevate the dialogue of water resilience and its role in economic resilience to a much higher level. Sorry, I don't know how to. There. Okay, so this is a transformation that we've been working now in South Africa for quite some time, no? For a couple of years. South Africa's economy is going through very interconnected transformations today. And this is the vision of the government, and it has been the vision now for quite some time, and it's a vision, and it's a way that National Treasury plans and finances this transformation. The first one is on decarbonization, and I think many of you here have heard of the major efforts that the government is undertaking through the decommissioning of power plants, and there we are working very closely in the decommission of one of its major power plants, Komati, in which we see the importance also of the role of water, and not only of water resources management in the decommission processes that coal plants and the mining use and consume quite large amounts of water for processing the coal, but also for cooling purposes, but also on the service side. Because what you find in the case of South Africa is that some of the poorest regions, in the case, for example, the province of Mpumalanga, in which this power plant sits, most of the employment and the municipalities are dependent on that source of energy. But the electricity sector or the energy company is also the one that provides the water supply and sanitation services to the municipalities, because the municipalities do not have that capacity to provide that service. So you decommission a power plant, then what happens with jobs? What happens with municipal services? That is the just transition, transition that you see also there. How do we make sure that we distribute income equally, that services are still provided for the poor, that we generate the employment that people are losing in this decarbonization transition, and the role of water in that. And the third one is obviously that to do that, you need to adapt, and your systems have to be resilient. So our job is to ensure that the economy keeps on running and the services keep on running from the water lens. So one of the first things that you need to understand is also we are talking about transitions that will require infrastructure and other sort of solutions, but that infrastructure and many of those solutions will be there for the long term, 100 years or more. So for that, it means that we have to understand how do we build resilience of the water systems to ensure that we can provide those services that are required to sustain the three transformations of the country. So here, for example, we've done a lot of work on understanding what is water scarcity and how water scarcity will look in the future in the different basins. But I think what is important here is that then you start overlaying this data with other type of indicators. So you start looking at, for example, where are these coal power plants located in the country and how that may change if you face scarcity in the future. Where are the poor populations located, and whether this will and whether water scarcity will impact these communities? Do they have access to services or not? So you start sort of interconnecting all of these issues with the other transitions that I explained before. And then also trying to understand the regional disparities within countries. Where are the poor populations? Where are the most vulnerable? What kind of shocks they may face in the future? And how do you ensure that you bring all of that information in the way that you plan and design your investments for the economic transformation of the country, not necessarily for the transformation of the water sector. We need to transform the sector if we want a stronger economy. And then the resilience comes into place when we can identify ex ante in this process what are some of those potential impacts? And here I want to address just a couple of ones. Poor households living in scarcity areas will be increasing. So that represents a huge challenge for the service provision of water supply and sanitation, but also it can have negative, for example, health impacts in those communities that can translate in less productive activities or less productive days and their contribution on economic activity. Water storage capacity will be reduced, but you use all of that storage capacity to provide services, to generate hydropower, to use it in some cases for cooling of renewables, but also of fossil fuels. So how do you address those issues now so you are ready for that economic transformation? And we have to build adaptation in the different sectors, not only in the water sector. So we know that the economic damages will be felt in different parts of the country, and we saw that the poor will be the most affected, so we have to address that in a very different type of policy setting. Even if we're looking at how the country may grow on the economic side, we need to make sure that there are more synergies in the policies and trade-offs, and that the poor can benefit from that. That's a just transition piece. We have to look at adaptation measures not only in water, but in transport, in energy, in cities. And for that, we have a benefit. That is, when you work directly with Treasury, or you work directly with a Presidential Committee of Climate Change, our work is cross-sectoral. So my colleagues are energy, transport, and I'm a water person. So that is how we are addressing this interconnection in the sector. And then the investment needs, and then how do you ensure that you put the resources that you need, but those resources are efficient. The public expenditure should be efficient. You have to maximize the synergies across these investments. You have to minimize the trade-offs, and you have to take care of the just transition aspects of this economic transformation. So just to conclude, we understand that the decarbonization transformation of the country makes sense, but we really have to understand how that affects the different income stratas, how does affect the different economic sectors, how do you build synergies and trade-offs across the sectors, and that they are properly identified. We can ensure that South Africa can decarbonize and be resilient, but again, we have to be very careful in having a set of policies that are clearly conducive across different sectors towards that objective. The transition will destroy jobs, and we know the type of jobs that will destroy, but it will also create jobs. So how do we prepare that the country for the next 10, 20, 30 years in that transition to ensure that there is no net job losses? Climate, of course, will disproportionately affect more the poorest. And the three transformations will need quite a large volume of investments. We estimate it's around 4.4% of GDP. And then the question is, how do we help, and this is the part of our work now, to ensure that those investments are resilient in the different sectors, but understanding what are the synergies and trade-offs across them. So thanks all of you for the time. I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Again, perfectly on time. And thanks for highlighting as well the importance of working across sectors. So one of the things we can drill into, because you built this multi-sectoral team working across energy, water, social policies, but then how does that translate into doing that across ministries would be quite an interesting question. We'll have our last case study presentation online with Carlos Mario Gomez, who's joining us from Madrid. So Carlos is an academic. He's a professor of economics at the University of Alcalá in Madrid. and is the chair of a research group on economic and institutional analysis in a water research institute attached to Madrid municipality. But he's been working internationally, both both in Spain and across the globe. So if we could have Carlos come in. He's going to tell us about the case of Spain specifically, which is facing very serious challenges and needs to take into account the impact of water depletion, but also very severe floods on its economy, which is based heavily on agriculture and tourism, as you know. So it's really very much at the heart of its concerns. Don't know if we have Carlos? Yeah? Great, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Sophie. And thank you very much for having me in this interesting meeting. I apologize for presenting online today. I would have loved to be there and extend our exchange beyond this session into a personal conversation. Sorry for that. The main idea of my presentation is presenting Spain as a case study where water policy, water governance is in the transition from a development model where water has been important to push development, economic development in critical areas as agriculture, tourism, and more recently energy, towards a model where economic policy, economic planning should be oriented to provide stability to the whole economy. So it's different. It means different purposes, different objectives, and then different priorities, indicators, management tools, and planning and policy support systems. The main idea is that Spain is at this moment a very interesting country to observe all these the aspects of this transition, but also a place where we can learn a lot from the barriers and challenges along that way. Next slide, please. Actually, as you can see from the small data, I'm not going to put too much evidence in the frame. Nowhere in the European Union is water more critical than in Spain and in the Mediterranean regions, but in particular in Spain. It is the most arid European country in Western Europe. It is the country where economic activities rely more in the provision of secure and a reliable supply of quality water. And it is also a place where the impact of climate change on water availability in the next years will be great, higher in the European Union. As you can see, it is in the more arid areas where water is more scarce, where the reduction in the renewable available resources will be more severe as a result of climate change in all the scenarios. So the basic idea is that water is important for three sectors that have been important in the regional economic development in Spain. First, Spain has experienced an important growth and a successful water planning and development for the agricultural sector, reaping the comparative advantage in this sector. Traditionally, more recent, this comparative advantage was developed in the tourism sector, and in the last 10 or 20 years, water has become also important for the stability of an electricity system that is in the middle of a very successful transition to a decarbonized system with more than 60% of the energy in the wind and solar energy. So water is essential to provide stability and to maintain energy prices at a reasonable level for the whole economy, as has been demonstrated recently in the after the Ukrainian invasion, the energy crisis in Europe. So we have a paradox of a semi-arid region with at least 3 critical sectors that are the basis of the economy because of the important linkages with all the other economic activities in this area that are water intensive. Nowhere in Europe, water is used and is demanded in that quantity and in that quality than in the most arid region of Europe. Not surprisingly, next slide, please. Spain is at the forefront of transitioning to a water resilient economy. We can show that Spain is a leader in water innovation in many areas, water regeneration of water, desalination, reuse, circular economy, digitalization, and the use of different technologies along the urban and the rural water cycle. The country has also proven its ability to deploy significant investments in the water sector and to mobilize funds, financial funds, and convert that into successful investments with the objective of addressing water scarcity, reducing drought exposure, and adapting to climate change. The basic idea is that providing stability to these critical sectors, agriculture, tourism, and energy, is critical to provide stability to the whole economy. Not only because these 3 sectors are important in quantitative terms, in terms of gross domestic product, in the participation of employment opportunities and so on, but because the 3 sectors are also important for the demand of inputs and for the production of outputs that are used in the rest of the economy. So this is what we call the spillover, the forward and backward linkages, and these sectors play the central role in the structure of local territory and land development and regional development all along Spain. One of our objectives is to demonstrate that the indirect impacts of the stability and the investment in providing water security for these sectors translates into important gains across the whole economy through these forward and backward linkages in agriculture, tourism, electricity, and in cities as well. But the question is that mobilizing these resources and implementing this, deploying these technological advances that do not necessarily result in increasing water security. The question is that something else should be needed, and we need something else to guarantee that these transformations result in better water security and enhance economic resilience for the Spanish economy as a whole. And this is the problem I want to center, this is the central issue I want to center my presentation, presenting 4 challenges. I think I would say these 4 ongoing challenges in which we are working on, and there is a collective effort to respond to them in the incoming years. Next slide, please. The first challenge is to make technology work for water security. This may sound strange because we tend to think that when we say water, when we make advances in circular economy, or when we add desalinated water to the system, automatically water is more scarce for the whole economy. But the evidence is not that way. We have been investing in these sectors in the last 20 years, but scarcity is still increasing. So the first lesson to be learned is that technology and investments are just means that to be put at the service of new and well-defined ends. And it is yet possible to increase water efficiency in any application in the agricultural sector, in cities and the industry, without reducing the scarcity of the economy as a whole. So increasing other uses or expanding the economy in other factors. The question is how to transform that into enhanced water security.
Carlos, sorry, just if you could speed up a little bit so that we have time for discussion. Maybe if you give the highlights and then we can go back to it.
I will put that.
Thank you.
The condition to do that is align incentives for that. There are some important paradoxes in the Spanish water system, and the incentives to use secure water sources like desalinated, regenerated water sources are not there, and at the same time there are big incentives to use groundwater and to continue depleting the groundwater. Can we move to the next slide? This is just one example of how pricing systems need to be adapted to the objective of enhanced water security. The third challenge is to transform these economic sectors. We have developed different demonstration projects and gathered some evidence showing that, for instance, developing sustainable tourism activities is a good alternative to demassify tourist destinations and increase the added value created in different areas like Mallorca or the Canary Islands, where the tourists can contribute to sustainability, relying on local sources, local amenities, and leave more value to the local economy. The same happens with the transformation of agriculture into conservation agriculture, low carbon agriculture, and so on. And we have also evidence from cities in different areas. So the productive transformation of water using sectors is important for the transition into a water secure economy and to provide stability to these critical sectors that are now threatened by water scarcity. And finally, let me just put the next slide, please. Some important ideas about how to make water resilience a cross-cutting policy goal into economic planning. Let's just mention 3 examples very rapidly. We need to avoid reactive responses to drought that happened this year in Barcelona and in Catalonia, where we were not prepared to that drought, although it was announced. And these reactive responses are emergency responses, not planned, expensive, and drag the resources that can be used for other purposes into the economy, and in particular in the water system. We need to coordinated responses because the responses to water scarcity continue to be individual and spontaneous. For instance, in the overexploitation of groundwater, and there is still a lot of competition between localities and regions, political jurisdictions in Spain that lead to uncoordinated response regionally, and the traditional response to water scarcity is developing new irrigation facilities, for instance, or new irrigation infrastructures that are locally reasonable but increase the water scarcity overall. So the general idea of including the objectives of water resilience into economic planning is to reveal long-term water security as a precondition for economic stability, prioritizing plan, control, and coordinated responses instead of the examples I just mentioned here that can be used as a good reason to review how the water sector is included into economic planning and improve the stability of this critical sector for the overall economy. Thank you very much. I finished with this. I'm sorry if I took more time than.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've had 3 very different perspectives, and from Spain, it's was very interesting to hear how deep a transformation is needed across critical sectors of the economy that really have the backbone of the Spanish economy. So it will require massive change. We've heard a lot about economic analysis. But then I'd like to bring my colleague Lila Davis, who's a policy analyst at the OECD, who is going to sort of change tack a little bit and talk to us about how can we make change happen, which are the types of stakeholders that we can engage, and that's also a key mandate of water resilience for economic resilience, is to engage with other communities outside of the water sector, particularly the financial sector community. So over to you, Lila, to tell us more about how this can be done jointly with financial institutions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie, and also thank you for the invitation. So as Sophie said, I'm here to kind of make that link between resilience and also the financial system. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the link between water-related risks and the financial system, potential implications for financial stability, and also potential roles for financial supervisors and also financial institutions in managing water-related risks and also in resilience. So we've already looked at some of the important economic impacts of water risks through the case studies, so I won't spend too much time on this. But I just wanted to highlight that this is common across developed and developing economies. We can see in Europe significant costs, 54 billion, which was highlighted in 2021 for flooding, but also water stresses characterized as the most important climate risk facing Central Europe. In the US, similarly, we've seen significant costs for drought and flooding, in Pakistan as well, and there are numerous examples across the globe. And this is just taking that very narrow lens of looking at droughts and floods, not looking at pollution or disruption to freshwater systems. So the main point here is that these economic costs are significant and they're everywhere. So what I wanted to do is sort of run you through how we conceptualize how risks go from being a risk to having an economic impact to then impacting on the financial system. And I think it's important to point this out because economic costs aren't necessarily equivalent to costs of the financial system. So those are very different. So this is why I wanted to lay this out at the start. So here, if you've done any work on nature, this figure will be quite familiar to you. It's how you look at the impacts of nature risk on the financial system, but it's adapted here for water. So we look at the drivers of risk as climate change, which is one of the main focuses of this session, but also these other drivers which are heavily linked to economic activities, our own actions. So land use change, overexploitation of water resources, pollution, invasive species. And then looking at this, at the OECD, we define water risk as too much, too little, polluted waters, disruption to freshwater systems, and looking at this as a physical risk, but also a transition risk linked to changes in policy or market sentiment, for example. And then these risks can then impact on the economy through capital destruction, business interruption, for example, farmers no longer able to do their activities because of drought, disruption to value chains, raw material price volatility, or adjustment or relocation of activities. And then this is where it can then impact on the financial system, and that can happen through different channels. So for example, it can be linked to loans, so the risk of credit default and credit risk, market risk, so looking at the performance of financial markets, liquidity risk, the ability of financial institutions to do their business, business risk, looking at profitability and also the ability to do their business, and underwriting risk, which is looking at insurance when a payout is going to be significantly higher than than the premiums that were charged, and so there's a gap which an insurance company has to cover. And this is something we notably saw in Europe in the flooding in 2021, where the scale and frequency of floods was unexpected by insurance companies. And I won't go into this, but there are also feedback loops where perhaps credit risk leads into higher interest rates, which means that a company is less able to borrow and therefore can impact on the risk itself by maybe polluting more or using water less efficiently. So there are links between that go backwards and forwards across the physical environment to economy to the financial system. And why is this important? Because it can happen at financial institution level, but this could also be at the level of a financial system if the impacts are large enough. And when we make that link between physical climate risks or water risks and financial stability, this then becomes something that's interesting to central banks that they have to be paying attention to. So for climate risk, that link has been made as early as 2015 with Mark Carney when he was the governor of the Bank of England, and he made a speech about climate change. And for nature, which is this figure that I'm showing here, for nature risks, this has been more recent with the Network for Greening the Financial System discussing it in the last few years. So central banks are already looking at climate risks, of course, we know this, and they have different ways of interacting with or assessing or managing climate change, and that's linked to their role in monetary policy, in macroeconomic policy, and also in their roles as financial supervisors. And amongst this arsenal of tools are climate stress tests, and this is one that is probably shown quite a lot because it's a case of the Netherlands, and they look at the impact of a flood event on the financial system. So these stress tests, when they look at physical climate risks, often linked to water, they're very interesting for us to make this link between water risk and financial stability. So in this stress test, the DNB, so the Dutch Central Bank, looked at 6 scenarios looking at low, intermediate, and extreme flood events in protected and unprotected zones in the Netherlands. And then they looked at the impact that this would have on the capital of the capital adequacy of their banks. And what they found is that in non-protected zones where there was very little, where there was a lower amount of real estate for residential and commercial users, the impact was relatively low. But in protected zones, when it was an extreme flooding event, this could have an actual impact on the financial system with over 700 basis points. And I don't want to go around raising alarm bells that the Netherlands is at risk of their financial system is at risk. That's not what this study was saying, but it was a communication. It provides an important message in terms of that link between flood risk and financial stability, even if it is an extreme flood event over all protected areas of the Netherlands. And so that means there's a role for discussion with other parts of government. There's an important message to financial institutions to think about their exposure to real estate, because this stress test was looking at real estate exposure in particular. So once again, the important message is around that link with financial stability. I won't go into too much detail because I know we're running a little bit behind. I'm taking a little time as well. But this is a study which is looking at nature risk. And so again, that was climate. This is looking at nature and the impacts and dependencies of different sectors on different ecosystems. And this is much more recent because the conceptual framework for understanding nature-related risks was only really published last year. So central banks are just getting their heads, starting really to get their heads around how they can look at impacts and dependencies on nature. But what we're finding in recent studies, such as this one, which was by the Green Finance Institute and Oxford, but also others, one was done by the OECD with the Hungarian Central Bank, is that water-related ecosystems are playing a significant role in nature-related financial risks. They're systematic, in these two studies at least, they've been amongst, if not the most significant of these ecosystems. And so there's a very important message there for us to take on board in terms of how do we continue to strengthen these assessments, and what can we bring, how as the water community as such can we continue to improve the way they're assessing these risks and therefore managing them. So I think I won't spend too much time on this, but I invite you to actually look at the study as well. I've put the link or the name of the study to this one, and also the former in the presentation slides. So what are the key messages? So last year, we published a working paper which was looking at the financial materiality of water-related risks and what this means. And our main message was that water really is at the heart of both climate and nature risks. And assessing water risks requires understanding impacts and dependencies on water and freshwater ecosystems. And so there are lots of different actions that can be taken. And here I'm just looking at financial institutions and financial supervisors, but of course there are lots of other actions that are required of policymakers, etc. So number one is increasing ambition and disclosure, and if you've been following the sessions in Water and Business, they talk about that, and that's really important because it helps us understand and assess the financially and environmentally material risks, so that the double materiality concept. Okay. But then it's about going beyond that, so not just looking at risk management, but being proactive and seeing how financial institutions can play a role in resilience and have investment strategies that enhance water security. And then for financial supervisors, which was one of the main points here, it was there are many things that they can do, and but amongst those is also prioritizing the management and governance of climate and nature risks, of which water is a key part, in their supervisory expectations of the financial institutions within their jurisdictions. Also, them themselves integrating water risks into risk assessment strategies with physical climate stress tests, as I just showed, but also eventual nature scenarios and stress tests with a focus on freshwater ecosystems. And finally, a key part of this is continuing to look at research, collaboration, and capacity building, because we don't have all the answers, central banks don't have all the answers yet, and it requires this collaboration across the different stakeholders to be able to continue to improve risk reporting and risk management strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So we heard about one type of financial actor engaging with central banks, and you've heard a lot. You've received a lot of information. So we thought we'd get a little bit of audience participation to get an idea of who is in the room. And so it'd be interesting to know whether any of you are from financial institutions. I'm sure we've got lots of water people here. But is anybody from a financial institution, which could include the World Bank? So anybody who, so we have one, yeah, who's making investment decisions, allocation, funding. It could be funding decision, it could be financing decisions, or it could be financial stability assessment, regulators, etc. No? That's interesting. So obviously we need to be, to get better at getting more financial institutions, and John, you will touch upon that in terms of what kind of webinars are undertaken by the initiative, by the Resilience Initiative, because that's one of the key areas of work. Well, we were going to invite people to contribute, but if you are not there, then I'll probably call back the panel. So if you could come back. Because I think what it would be interesting to get your brief views about is how do we make this happen? Which do you think are the institutions that can, and I'm, in the interest of time, I'm bombarding you with a question as you are moving to the table. But effectively, how do you think which institutions can play a leading role to foster the shift in approach that you are recommending? To place water at the heart of policies and practices, it may be one, it may be several in coalition, but what, if you had to find who the leader would be, what would that be? And perhaps I'll start with Felicia in the order of, you have a mic and you've been at play doing it in California. So what would be your advice on that?
Well, even not California, I think just, this is more of a dream list rather than what happens. I think, for example, I mean, you have to be a little bit of a nerd for this to happen, but when the Secretary General of the UN started talking about adaptation in water, I was just so happy I was practically crying. Because, again, I'm a political hack at heart, even though I know a bunch of stuff about water and operations, and just a little bit about everything as more of an expert generalist than a deep expert in anything, but the way the policy world works and the public world works and political world, it's accessible statements that regular people can hear. And if regular people hear it, then politicians know their constituents are hearing it. And so, as someone once said, although there are fabulous exceptions, politicians are better at following than leading most of the time. And the exceptions are the ones we all love, but the rest of them can also become leaders if we lead first. And so those clear, accessible comments are important. I think Mark Carney is a hero in this for being able to say the things he said. I'm sure he had very complex things to say as well, but he was able to say short, punchy things. And I think some of the things, I think that's important. So I think more banks and other institutions saying something. One of the biggest breakthroughs we had in California water before this turning of the battleship in the last decade was a thing called the Bay Delta Accord. And we worked that was when I was in the federal government. One of the things we worked hard on was getting the business community to speak up and say, you've got to solve these problems. Because in terms of water, ignoring the problem and just catering to different constituent groups is a full-time sport. I mean, that's part of why we did the Water Action Plan, to get people off the cocktail party chatter, the political chatter, and into action. And it worked really well. And Bank of America played a lead role in us being able to get those deals done, because they came out and said, for the economic future of California, you have to figure this issue out. So just a few ideas.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe if you could hand over the mic to Niels, because we just heard about the example from the Netherlands, where the Dutch central bank is, embracing this approach. I mean, obviously, the Netherlands has been very aware about the water risks for centuries. But how do you see this political economy play out in the Netherlands, and which institutions can and should take the lead, in your opinion, outside of water,
Well, first I like to build on what my neighbor was saying, and it's also a lot about communication. In the Netherlands, water was always taken for granted. There was sufficient, we could steer, we could control it. But at some point, and I think also your institution played a role in that, we had a water governance in the Netherlands report, Are We Fit for the Future? It was done by the OECD. And that was a moment where also we realized, no, it's not always, we can't always take it for granted, and we have to also make the general public more aware of, in essence, the risk. And also, behind that, of course, as you were saying, also that's gained some political traction. So I think that's, we also always, we are mostly quite technical, inward looking, but to look outside the communication side is, I think, something we really should make a lot of effort. And that's, I think that is where we saw a shift compared to the past. And to your question on the central bank, as you rightly say, well, it's not that we are not safe, but I think it's also part of awareness about the risks, and we like facing these risks, and so we can deal with them. And I think that's also where our central bank plays a very positive role. Also, these kinds of map, because it comes from our central bank, make also politicians quite aware. So that's quite helpful.
Thank you. Maybe Diego, I turn to you. I mean, you mentioned that in South Africa, it's really at the highest level of governance that these reforms are taken. So what can you tell us about the, again, the political economy? How did that happen in the first place? And what would be your advice for other countries?
And I wanted to raise, I think, an issue on this financial materiality. So I think it's you can apply it to the central bank, but you can apply it to any national agency responsible for budgetary support, I think. The fact of the matter is that, with the exception maybe of energy, like water, 85%, 90% of the money comes from the public sector. So I think you can use the sort of the stress testing type of process to show Treasury and Finance what could be the negative effects of inaction, maybe, or of building resilient, what is a positive effect. But, more important, I think, linked to that is the notion of how do you ensure that your public spending is as efficient as possible, and you shy away from, or you move away from sort of output-based distribution of resources to a more incentive, approach, right? And I think that's where we're moving. For example, in South Africa, that we are helping the government in transform all the subsidies to the urban sector in basically results-based, right? So all of these reforms, right? like a type of a P4R, but national subsidy systems, which means that you have to go to finance and treasury. So I would say it's twofold. One is a financial materiality discourse. if you don't do this, this is what could happen to your economy or your transitions. And at the same time, to say, if you want to build economic resilience and resilience of the sector, this is how you transform also your public distributions and allocations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So over to you, Laila. I mean, in terms of institutions that you think need to be engaged, who should be in the lead? What kind of coalitions can be formed in order to make this change happen, particularly focusing maybe on the financial side, since that's what you're focused on? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think there are different aspects to it. There's the idea of having champions, because you need that communication piece. You need people to understand that water is an important risk. And also, we've been talking about climate, biodiversity, water, and it sort of becomes a list of things to address when actually that's not the case. They're very highly interlinked, and it's making sure we're making those linkages and we're helping those initiatives be more powerful because of those linkages. So initiatives like the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, the Vital Water Initiative, that speak outside of the water sector as well, I think are incredibly impactful. But then at the technical level, all these studies that I mentioned, those are undertaken by not just one institution, but several. So for the study in the UK looking at nature risk, that was Oxford, Green Finance Institute, many different researchers coming together and sharing that expertise, because it's a lot of different expertise that is needed, and it's not something that exists already. So it's about bringing that together. So yes, across central banks, the network for greening the financial system, outside of central banks, in looking at academia, the water sector, we really need to be bringing together these technical groups to have the expertise together.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Well, we'll hear a little bit later about the Global Commission, because Hank is, kindly joined the session. But before that, I'd like to invite questions from the audience, and there's some online. Yeah, so Georgette, would you like to?
So one of the questions that we got online was building a little bit on the poll, which showed, as they said, a bit of a lack of engagement with/from finance and investment sector. So they're wondering that the studies presented are quite guided to the benefit of policymakers. What sort of studies, if there are any, are there that are benefiting the financial and investment sector when it comes to building that water resilience?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So I think... So the question is about studies that are...
aimed at the financial sector. Yeah.
Okay.
So what kind of studies are there that are directly aimed at the financial sector?
Okay. So I think these types of stress tests are very impactful. And in Europe, already there are numerous countries that are doing it, Italy, Spain, and looking at different types of risks. Sometimes it might be transition risks. But when you're looking at physical climate risks, often they are focusing on water specifically. And so I think those are really important communication tools about where potential exposure may lie within that financial system. Mm-hmm. And again, the work on nature as well, I would say this work in the UK, it also shows potential risk. And so by actually taking action to improve resilience, there's a benefit really to taking action early and making sure they're engaging in risk management, but also more sustainable investment activities.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add to that, there's a study that will be coming out. It's interesting, I've written about it 3 years in a row, and every year I've said it's coming out later this year. And every year that has been true, apparently. I just keep checking in. Some folks at UCLA who are now, one is at Oxford and the other is at University of Texas, and it was something commissioned by the city to show what is the cost of exactly that. What's the cost of economic disruption in a way that's intelligible, so you have a better comparator for the massive investment it's going to take. I mean, that's the issue of the 30-year view and getting things in motion, is that it's a massive investment. You don't pay it all in 1 year, obviously, but how do you compare it to the much more massive cost? Similar example in the San Francisco Bay, where fully 2/3 of the impact of sea level rise in all of California is just in San Francisco Bay, which sounds huge. It's not the biggest population center in the country, but then you think about it, it's a bathtub, with all those people around it that's heavily urbanized. And for them, understanding that they are going to have to spend trillions, even to do their nature-based approach, which is a much more resilient and a smarter way to go, and you get multiple benefits than a bunch of seawalls, which just accelerate the force of sea level rise as opposed to dissipating it, it's going to cost them a couple $1 trillion.
Yeah.
But the cost of inaction is going to be $3 or $4 trillion. That is a hard thing to explain, but people can understand those numbers at least to get moving on early investment.
So putting numbers and things and communicating to the in the way that financial institutions can understand is key, right? And there are a lot of studies coming up, from WWF, from OECD, from other, multiple actors, from the initiative that is looking to engage with the financial institutions. Keen to get some more questions from the audience. Yes, here. Okay. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, my name is Shubhi Goyal. I'm a Master of City Planning student at MIT. And my question is, while you touched upon changes in land use and overexploitation of resources, I would love to know, are there any conversations happening between economists, financial players with urban planners to align different financial strategies with land use reforms?
Maybe Diego or Felicia, do you want to?
I can answer, but I already talked too much. You like them. Sometimes I don't. It depends. When I was a public official, I liked it less than I like it when I'm not. In some places, yes, is going to be the answer. I mean, I think, again, San Francisco Bay, and I saw this in Phoenix when I was in the federal government. It's unusual. It's a great question because they're separate silos. All of these are separate silos. That's particularly the problem. It's why having the financial institutions step in is important because they work across different sectors. So it's a very powerful voice on the overall economic impact. The land use divide and planning divide is really difficult because the language is difficult, the sectors are difficult. Again, in San Francisco Bay, there are a number of efforts centered around climate adaptation to pull people together. It's not simple, but there's a great organization called California Forward that just got a particularly adept economist who also has been a policy maker that does an economic summit every year. I was the co-chair of it years ago. Before she was there, I'm going to get involved again. So there are organizations in different places that are able to do this integration. I don't know it happening other than outside a more regional or local.
Any more questions from the... Yeah, Gouffran?
Gouffran Mansour. From Ecopsis. A quick question. So looking at the transformational, changes that need to happen in the economy to adapt to a water stress world, is it true that it's a win-win situation between society and businesses? And as part of the language and communication, shouldn't we accept that some businesses will suffer and our lives will actually change in practice, not just, in the long term, but soon. I'm thinking here about the case of Spain, where he described that it's not just the technology or the investment that matters, but also those transformational changes that need to happen in certain sectors for, to move on to a really adaptive economy.
Mm-hmm. I don't know do we still have Carlos online? Or yeah. So maybe we can address that question to Carlos. And is it fair to talk about a just transition? And will they be sort of net losers? I mean, how do we handle that issue? Carlos?
This is a very interesting question because we tend to oversell the solutions and show that there are many benefits in this productive transition, ignoring in many cases the cost of the transition. But the important lesson here is that this transaction cost in implementing the technologies, in expanding the use of the technologies, in the diffusion of these technologies, need to be recognized and can be presented in a transparent way to both business and politicians. We can mention many different experiences, for instance, in the use of biological plastics in agriculture in southern Spain, where there are costs because they are more expensive. They need to manage things, the residuals, the construction, and so on. But there are instruments to support this transition, and once the technology is used in a minimum scale, it becomes viable, financially viable. That happens as well with many solutions that can be implemented in the agricultural sector. Conservation agriculture, low carbon agriculture requires time to transform the soil, the structure of the soil, buy new capital for the and we think, and many people is working on this, that this can be developed in the connection between water transition and the common agricultural policy, transforming the subsidies in the common agricultural policy into payment for ecosystem services or another variety to facilitate the transition. So in a case-by-case analysis, everything can be developed and many solutions can be developed and can be applied on land. It is true that water scarcity is a good driver of these transitions in many areas, and we had this demonstration in Spain.
Thanks, Carlos. I think Diego also wanted to comment maybe on South Africa or broader.
Sort of broader, I think, because I think it's a very cool question, no? Very interesting question. And, you know, as a pure economist, I would say that there are no win-wins. It's all about trade-offs, right? And you need to identify those trade-offs, look how to minimize their impact, and design the instruments to mitigate those impacts. It's like I was saying, you say decarbonization, everyone is, says is the best Coke in the desert. Well, yes, you decarbonize an economy, you may have additional water to reallocate, but you're going to leave a lot of people without jobs. And this fallacy of, no, we retrain them in 6 months. Well, try it, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work in situ so easily, right? When you look at the education of the people and no.
So
it's not that easy.
About communication, should we be like more forward?
It's communication, but it's also quantifying the trade-offs very clearly, right? That's why we have cost benefit and CG modeling and to quantify, identify the trade-offs and redirect your public spending to subsidize where it's needed, right? And then you can decarbonize. But to say, no, we decarbonize the economy and it's all nice and that, no, there are trade-offs.
Yeah,
that's
thank
my
you.
point.
I think there was one question here, yeah. And then that's the last question because then we want to hear more from the Global Commission. So very quickly. Quick question, quick answer.
Very quick. Hello, Esteban Boch from JZ. Not currently working on this matter, but just as a water enthusiast here. You mentioned about the importance of working with different sectors at the same time. We heard about tourism, agriculture, energy. And you work with interdisciplinary teams. So at some point in all this process, you have to have an interdisciplinary or cross-sectoral planning discussion. Is there, and also in that discussion, I guess you come up with some, what does resilience means for energy and what does resilience means for each sector? And you have to come up with kind of, I guess, measurements or indicators. How does that then really translate into this efficient spending?
Very easy question to answer in 1 minute. So, Diego, do you want to give us your take on that?
But for me, it's almost easy because that's where we are now, and we're preparing what is called program for results in South Africa to reform the municipal services to become more resilient, and then we define for each 3 sectors: energy, water supply and sanitation, and waste. For each one of those, we work with it's a cross-sectoral team that defines what is resilience and how do you measure resilience, and linked to that indicator is a disbursement, right? So in year 1, you achieve that indicator, I'll pay you. You don't achieve it, I don't pay, as a country, right? So that's where we are now in that.
So, and this being a World Bank project, it will all be online and available, so you can take inspiration from these indicators. Yeah. Felicia, do you want the final word? We almost at time, so thank you very much to our panelists. And I'd like to invite Hank. So I think Hank Hoving doesn't need much introduction in the water community. He's currently heading the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which will soon release its report. So how does all of this resonate with what the Commission will announce to the world in less than a month's time? Thank you.
Don't make it too exciting. Our planning was just cut by with 4 weeks by our host. No, mid-October. I hope. Yeah. So I listened into half of the conversation. So I'm sorry I didn't hear everything. But I think the argument Diego meant on trade-offs couldn't be more to the point. And listening to the discussion, I take a little bypass and then get to the Commission. Before I did this, I was water envoy. But before that, I worked for the Obama administration post-Hurricane Sandy. We set up an NGO. And with that NGO, which I still volunteer on, we did risk assessment across the US. And we actually developed a risk atlas. And it showed that 91% of all counties in the US have suffered multiple disasters. And the cost of them are both in relief, fixing, on a humanitarian and an infrastructure scale, and rebuilding are massive. That Atlas had an update, and it's now called the Accountability Atlas, because that's exactly what it's about. Because it's not about risk, but it's really about how do you account for what is actually happening. So that look it up, whoever you are from the US, it's a helpful tool to understand what really risk means, and they give you also an opportunity to move towards solutions. What the NGO did in the state of New York, worked with all those communities and counties, and they came up with policy and regulations to mitigate those risks in investment. And that law got more votes than the governor when she was elected. Because there was really local understanding of what risk and accountability mean, and willingness to prevent those risks from impacting, to provide funding, to actually invest in resilience. So there was this trade-off, had an individual public awareness across the state. So I think the information and the communication, as was mentioned, are key to understand your level of actionability. Sorry, yes, the Commission. Yeah. Whatever, yeah. The Global Commission on the Economics of Water was set up in the lead-up to the UN 2023 Water Conference by the Dutch government, convened as a third pillar after the Stern and the Dasgupta review, not in the same manner with a Stern or a Dasgupta and a report alone, but as a commission representing a community way beyond water and economics. It's led by 4 co-chairs, President Tharman Shanmugaratnam of Singapore, Dr. Ngozi Okonye-Iweala, the DG of the World Trade Organization, Johan Rockström, who was shortly here today, the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate, and Mariana Mazzucato, leading the Institute for Innovation and Public Policy in London at UCL. They chair a commission of over 20 commissioners, and in that commission we have a youth activist from Kenya and elderly activist from South Africa, economists, environmentalists, financial experts, people with past in the public and the private sector, and half of them never worked on water. They really don't know what water is before they enter there, except for that they sometimes drink it, I hope, and use for cooking. But in their work, were never involved in what the value of water was. And the Commission's task was to start to understand what this value really means, and what does this understanding mean for the principles of how do you deal with this, and ranging from policy to governance to finance to data to capacity to partnerships and beyond. With the work of the Commission, we're in the midst of a super larger dynamic. So it's not that all of a sudden we will come up with silver bullets, because they don't exist, as the panel said. And we recognize that we stand on the shoulders of this, in this whole stream of many efforts of science, of policy, of practice. But we have the opportunity to converge in these 2 years, which is nothing if you look at the subject, converge what is out there and add our perspective with new science and present opportunities to take a next step. So we really we want to be humble and modest in that sense, but at the same time ambitious. With that first part of the understanding how water relates to our economy and what that value actually means, we look at the full hydrological cycle. And this is where we get the first feedback from the community. And this full hydrological cycle is about blue and green, and where green is actually not addressed in policy at all. Transpiration, or in a nice word, evapotranspiration, accounts for, on a global average, 50% for rain on land. So that means that when we think about rain and the importance for our economy, for food, agriculture, our biodiversity, our living conditions, half of that, and in some places 70% of that, comes from our biodiversity and land use. So the relationship between land use, the economy that is behind that, which was presented as a risk, but is actually a driver of risk, too, next to that there is a risk felt, are amplified and showed how the relationship between blue and green are literally not a blue thread, but a blue and green thread to the economic perspective. So this full hydrological cycle, and the Commission said in its first presentation, should be seen as a global common good. Why? Because it's not only about the relationship between green water and how it rains on land, it's also that these atmospheric flows, rivers, connect ourselves across the globe. And the report will show with the latest data how countries are literally connected, and we show where your rain comes from and where you export rain to, show how interdependent the world is. So we have transboundary rivers, but we have intercontinental atmospheric flows that demand that when we think about governance and the value, you can't solve it on a local, regional, or even continental scale. And that points to a big hole in our global governance. I have to stop.
Yeah. I'll have to cut you off. Because
okay, so then the last part is, so this is the first. The second is that we will present 5 pathways for resolving this. And these pathways are no rocket science, but they, of course, will focus on food, from diets to subsidies and the 380 billion that goes on. Land use and biodiversity is explained. Climate change, less so adaptation, way more the mitigation, the emission part, the circular economy, and of course WASH, but on the WASH part don't expect any salvation. I'm sorry, this commission is, will not all of a sudden change the whole WASH debate. And then we'll present an agenda moving forward, because as said, we find ourselves in the middle of something. Great. October 17, it's online, so everybody can join. And after that, we'll seek opportunities to make those missions a reality. So it really is about how we can connect this world with the world out there, because we won't be able to solve the water crisis from the water sector. The only way to deal with this is to solve this crisis in the other sectors around. This is where solutions come from. Sorry.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So, John, you've been very patient. I'll open the floor to you to, I think one of the ideas behind the Commission is to have a report that can then be taken up by actors in the water sector and enable them to also engage with other actors outside of the water sector. So what does WR4RER intend to do in this area?
Thank you very much. My name is John Matthews. I'm the executive director of a group called AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And we're the host for this initiative, Water Resilience for Economic Resilience, a group that's really designed to help catalyze and connect the communities of climate change, especially around resilience, water, with thinking about economic policy and practice. And it's a broad group. Many of the people are, in fact, economists. Most of the people who spoke were. I am not an economist. I'm a resilience scientist. So it's actually quite a broad group. And we're trying to communicate that the language of resilience is really the language of water, and that we need to make sure that we really mobilize water as this resource for resilience. Quick notes, we have some webinars that are coming up, how we think about the banking system and water resilience, how we think about a credit rating system, so groups like Moody's, for instance, how we value investments and communicate that value, and how it might be connected to climate risk and climate resilience. And then one on macroeconomic policy. We have a report that has been alluded to already by Niels that published a few months ago. I want to maybe add like a quick little story. A lot of what we've heard are at a national level, or maybe talking about sectors, maybe global institutions like the Global Commission. But these are actually quite personal stories. I note that most of you are not from financial institutions. My son, at the beginning of COVID, he was quite young. He wasn't responding to Zoom school. And my wife and I, we reached out to see if we could find a tutor that could come for a few hours a day and work with him in person while we were working. And the person that we hired was perfect. He was a young teacher, had a young family, and he had just moved to our state. Our state is just north of where Felicia is. Oregon, just a little bit north of California. We're a wetter state. And this young teacher, I asked him after we had hired him, why did you move to Oregon? Because he just moved in the previous month or so. He said, I moved because my wife and I, we wanted to buy a house. And we could afford a house while we were living in California, but we couldn't afford the insurance. That is a climate failure of the financial system. And that is something that is playing out not at just these high levels, major institutions like the World Bank. It's playing out in our lives. We are making different decisions right now based on changes that are happening in the financial and economic system as we speak. Resilience sometimes it's widely used in this conference, and the language of risk it sounds a little cold to me, because it sounds like, in that sense, resilience is how we make things less bad. I think actually our message with this initiative is how we think about prosperity, how we think about a better life despite climate change, and how we need to use the financial system as the tool to help build that going forward.
Thank you. I think we have to stop because...
No, I want to thank Sophie and the speakers, and Georgette, who's helped online, and Alex from very far away, and also to our support crew here locally. Thank you very much.